Okay, Emily. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another AHI Virtual Speakers Forum edition. As always, we come to you live from our AHI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Hellenic House. My name is Nick Larigakis, and I'm the president of the American Hellenic Institute. And on behalf of the American Hellenic Institute, our nonprofit independent Greek-American Public Policy Center, it is my pleasure to host our next virtual speakers presentation here today that commemorates the significance of the Battle of Crete, with special guest presenters, Professor Alexandros Kirou and Professor Van Koufoudakis. 2021 marks the 80th anniversary of the heroic Battle of Crete. Many historians will agree that it is one of the most significant battles of World War II. The people of Crete fought admirably and bravely against Nazi German forces and caused the Germans to delay for up to 2 months its invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa. This delay arguably changed the final outcome of World War II, as the Germans had to face the brutal Russian winter, which, as we all know, did not bode well for their campaign. The Battle of Crete is significant for many other reasons. The resistance displayed by civilians, the use of intelligence to combat the Nazis, and the first-time invasion by airborne military, among others. I would also like to point out that in previous Congresses, there have been congressional resolutions introduced that recognize the historical significance of this great battle. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I present our distinguished speakers here today, Professors Kirou and Koufoudakis, to provide their collective expertise about the significance of the Battle of Crete. But before I do, I would also like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors for this event, which you would have seen on the screen before we began. We'd like to thank them for their continuing support, which helps us to bring to you these AHI Virtual Speakers Forum. To begin our presentation today and our panel discussion, we will begin first with Professor Alexander Kirou. A few words about the professor. His full bio has been listed on the invitation of this event. Professor Kirou is a professor of history and director of the program in East European and Russian Studies at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts, where he teaches on the Balkans, Byzantium, and the Ottoman Empire. He received his PhD in East European history at Indiana University. His many and diverse book, chapter, and journal article publications focus on famine relief in Axis-occupied Greece, Balkan diasporas, Orthodox Christianity and the origins of international humanitarianism, and war and peace in Byzantium. He is also the former associate editor of the Journal of Modern Hellenism. Professor Kirou has guest lectured at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Oxford universities, and he has been interviewed and quoted in several major periodicals, including the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and the Huffington Post. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure once again to have with us for another AHI Virtual Speakers Forum, a repeat lecturer here at our platform, Professor Alexander Kirou. Professor, it's always a pleasure to have you with us, and I pass on the Zoom platform to you now for your comments to commemorate the Battle of Crete.
Thank you, Nick. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. Thank you to you. Thank you to Emily, to the entire AHI community for organizing today's event, and for extending to me the privilege to contribute through my presentation, which will be focused on the historical and major contours of the Battle of Crete as part of our remembrance today of the Battle of Crete. I would like to begin my talk by noting that this is a particularly auspicious moment to begin thinking about the significance of the Battle of Crete. The current moment of positive upgrade and expansion of US-Greece bilateral relations, and more broadly, the expanding role and respect for Greece in Europe as well, has been influenced in large part by the recognition in the Western Alliance of the absolute geostrategic importance of Greece in general, and Crete in particular. And looking back to the Second World War, we can see that both British and German strategists recognized the crucial strategic importance of Crete. Therefore, the Battle of Crete tells us a great deal about the present day conversation and role of Greece in a rapidly changing world order, as well as the extent to which leadership and understanding shapes how geostrategic assets are capitalized or squandered. So I hope that today my talk conveys the fact that Crete, as in the 1940s, 80 years later, remains a crucial geostrategic asset for Western interests. Now, among American historians and popular consumers, let's say, of World War II history, the Battle of Crete is the most well-known operation of the Second World War in the Balkans. There is a certain characterization to the understanding of the Battle of Crete that proceeds from the unquestioned narrative that the Battle of Crete was supposedly an expression of the military juggernaut and operational brilliance of the German war machine, and that the British defeat reflected that fact. Today, I will present to you an alternative interpretation. I want to make 2 points in my talk. One, the Allied defeat was not the result of German operational brilliance and superiority in arms. And two, the German victory was decisively facilitated by the incompetence of British leadership. The legendary airborne assault against Crete was the culmination, as we all know, of the German campaign against Greece and Yugoslavia launched in the spring of 1941. This was an action Hitler was forced to launch to rescue Mussolini from Italy's disastrous and humiliating failure to conquer Greece in the fall of 1940. In response to the Italian fiasco and in advance of his invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler ordered his general staff to prepare an invasion of Greece. For his part, Churchill was convinced that it was necessary to show some support for Greece, after all, the only country on the European continent successfully fighting the Axis. And so consequently, beginning in January 1941, Churchill ordered the dispatch of 60,000 troops to Greece. This token force of combined British and Commonwealth troops was, however, too small and woefully inadequate to make any meaningful contribution to the defense of Greece. The Germans launched their invasion of Greece on April 6, 1941, and Athens was occupied by German troops on April 27. Demonstrating greater aptitude for retreating than fighting, the evacuation of the British and Commonwealth forces from the Greek mainland was completed by April 30. Although enormous amounts of heavy weapons and vehicles were abandoned during the British withdrawal, the operation succeeded in evacuating approximately 57,000 troops, half of which were transported to Crete to join a small British and Greek garrison force already on the island. British and German military planners fully grasped the strategic value of Crete. With the onset of the Desert War in Egypt and Libya, the importance of Crete was in fact magnified. Crete's strategic potential was enormous, especially to the British. If the island's 3 airfields were transformed into full-fledged air bases, and the port facilities of its excellent natural harbors, especially Suda Bay, expanded and modernized, then air and naval units operating from a well-defended Crete could dominate the air over and the sea lanes throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Hitler was therefore determined to deny the British control of the island. On April 30, the British-born New Zealand general, Bernard Freeburg, was appointed commander of all Allied forces on Crete. Freiburg's force comprised roughly 15,000 British, 10,000 Greek, 8,000 New Zealand, and 7,000 Australian troops. Freiburg's force was plagued by serious problems. Most units faced shortages of basic supplies. They lacked heavy support weapons. They even lacked sufficient ammunition. Freiburg's force lacked transport vehicles, and it was acutely handicapped by shortages of armor, artillery, and especially anti-aircraft guns. Furthermore, the Royal Air Force had no real tangible presence on Crete, leaving the island ground forces with virtually no support to face the impending German assault. The German attack on Crete, codenamed Operation Mercury, was planned by General Karl von Student, architect of the Luftwaffe's overall airborne forces. Because the British enjoyed naval supremacy in the waters around Crete, Operation Mercury called for an airborne invasion. Once Hitler approved Mercury on April 25, Student quickly assembled his invasion force in mainland Greece. In all, 22,000 troops made up the assault force. The brunt of the attack would be carried out by the Luftwaffe's 10,000-man 7th Airborne Division, which consisted of 1 assault and 3 parachute regiments. The air assets assigned to Operation Mercury were enormous. They included 700 troop transport planes and gliders, and 700 bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Student's plan was more straightforward than imaginative. 3 of the 7th Airborne Division's regiments would be dropped, respectively, outside the 3 towns, Malemi, Rethymno, and Iraklion, on the north coast of Crete, where the island's airstrips were located. Once captured, the airfields would be used for the landing of heavy weapons and 5,000 mountain troops. The Airborne Division's 4th Regiment would be dropped in the area around Chania and Suda, the goal being to capture the 2 towns' harbors in preparation for the arrival of some 7,000 seaborne troops. Starting at 5:30 on the morning of Tuesday, May 20, a massive German aerial attack degraded the Allies' paltry air defenses and bombed troop concentrations around the island's airfields. At 8 a.m., the first wave of German airborne troops began to descend onto their targets. The German losses in the first few hours of the attack were appalling. At Malemi, the 1st Assault Regiment parachuted and glided into a sector defended by elements of the 5th New Zealand Infantry Brigade, the 1st Greek Provisional Regiment, and the 300 cadets of the Greek Evelpidon Officers Academy. The Greek and New Zealand troops laid waste to the Germans, whose casualties were so heavy they were unable to make any progress at all towards Malemi. The Assault Regiment lost half of its men and achieved nothing. The 3 parachute regiments directed against Rethymno, Iraklion, and Chania Suda also suffered tremendous casualties and failed to secure their objectives. No landing strips were captured, and the airborne troops in the 4 drop zones remained isolated and were unable to establish contact with each other. By midday, the entire German operation was on the verge of collapse. However, failing to comprehend the situation, the New Zealand commanders at Malemi, where German casualties had been the most severe, stalled and lost the opportunity to destroy Student's assault regiment. Because of poor assessments of the Germans' fighting condition and because of disruptions of communication caused by the Luftwaffe's bombing, Freiberg and his headquarters in Chania had no clear picture of what was happening across the island. Consequently, he was unable to prevent several of his subordinates from making a series of catastrophic blunders that turned near victory for the Allied forces into disaster. The Allied defense was breached, and the tide turned on the night of May 20, when Colonel L.W. Andrews, commanding the key New Zealand battalion engaged at Malemi, ceded ground to the Germans in order to regroup his forces on the hills overlooking the Malemi airfield. The voluntary withdrawal of the New Zealand troops enabled the Germans to rush forward and capture the landing strip. From his headquarters in, where else, the Hotel Grand Britannia in Athens, Student seized this opportunity and immediately ordered reinforcements of men and weapons to be crash landed onto the airstrip. Consequently, on the afternoon of May 21, the first wave of Student's 5,000 mountain troops successfully landed at Malemi. The Germans now had enough troops to consolidate and extend their position. Student continued pouring reinforcements onto the airfield at Malemi during the early hours of May 22. Control of the airstrip rescued the Germans from defeat. When the reinforced German units in the Malemi sector resumed their attack, the Allied forces were driven steadily eastward, losing one defensive position after another. Faced with a constant stream of fresh German troops and defenseless against the overwhelming power of the Luftwaffe, it was clear to Freiburg that any continued effort to hold Crete was futile. On May 27, the order was given to withdraw from the island. On the night of May 28, most of the 5,000 strong British garrison in Heraklion was evacuated by sea. The British commander of the garrison neglected to inform his Greek counterpart of the impending evacuation, leaving the Greek forces in Heraklion on their own. Meanwhile, the main Allied forces began an arduous retreat southward to the small fishing village of Sfakia on Crete's southern coast. Dug into defensive positions to form a protective rear guard, the 8th Greek Provisional Regiment repulsed a series of German attacks over several days, thus enabling the primary British and Commonwealth column to retreat to Sfakia. Over 4 nights, more than 18,000 British and Commonwealth troops were evacuated from throughout Crete. On June 1, the Germans reached Sfakia, fighting ended, and the next day the German forces began a wave of terror killings against civilians. The battle for Crete was an unmitigated disaster for the British. Out of its total force of 40,000, more than 5,000 Allied troops had been killed, 3,000 wounded, and over 15,000 captured. To place this defeat in comparative perspective, almost exactly 1 year earlier, out of a force of almost 250,000, the British Army at Dunkirk lost 3,500 troops killed and 40,000 captured. Magnifying the British disaster at Crete, the Royal Navy lost 2,000 sailors killed, as well as crippling losses of major ships, which resulted in its withdrawal altogether from the Aegean and flight to Egypt. The Battle of Crete was, in fact, the costliest British naval engagement of the entire Second World War. The battle for Crete should not have been an Allied failure. The Greek troops, as well as some New Zealand forces, fought with exceptional ferocity. Yet the tenacity of individual soldiers could not make up for the shockingly poor leadership of the British and Commonwealth commanders, whose bungling and inertia doomed the defense of Crete. Well before the German invasion of Greece, Churchill had expressed the view that Crete was a crucial strategic asset that had to be held at all costs. However, Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, the British commander-in-chief in the Middle East, failed to put into practice Churchill's view, and instead he ignored Crete. In November 1940, as the Greeks were fighting the Italians in Albania, it was agreed between Athens and London that the British would assume responsibility for the defense of Crete. Nevertheless, Wavell did not take this mission seriously. Reflecting Wavell's neglect of Crete, his appointment of General Freiburg to take command of the island's forces was his 7th change of commanders in 5 months. None of the previous commanders had been in their posts long enough to have had any effect on making the island ready for war. When Freiburg arrived in Crete on April 30, he was confronted by an astonishing lack of preparation. No attempt had been made by the British to build field works where defenses were required. No beaches were obstructed against potential amphibious landings. No aircraft pens had been built to protect planes. And no attempt had been made to improve communications. Finally, no commander before Freiburg had even bothered to develop a plan of defense for the island. The hopelessness of Freiburg's situation was compounded by his own mistakes. Here, I think it's noteworthy to point out that before the German attack even began, the details of Operation Mercury were known to the British. Thanks to a breakthrough by their intelligence branch, Ultra, the British were able to decipher the Germans' encrypted messaging code, Enigma. As a result, the British possessed the Germans' exact battle plan almost 1 month before the invasion. However, to protect Ultra's secret breakthrough from even Freiburg, Wavell did not reveal to Freiburg the actual source and thus authenticity of the intelligence. Instead, this information was passed on to Freiburg as filtered data from spies operating in occupied Greece. Proceeding from skepticism, Freiberg was reluctant to accept the validity of these reports, and he was equally dismissive of Greek intelligence officers who presented him with actual captured German documents that confirm the precise plan for an airborne invasion. Indeed, Freiberg thought an airborne attack to be completely impossible, and so he positioned his forces to face an amphibious invasion. Had Freiberg deployed his forces, especially in the Malemi sector, to thwart an airborne attack rather than a beach landing, which never took place, the Battle of Crete would probably have ended on the same day it began. The Germans ultimately succeeded on Crete not because of the supposed brilliance of their operational plan, but because of the British command's negligence and failure to act competently. In this sense, the Germans were victorious because the mistakes they made, and they made many, were simply not as numerous or appalling as those made by the British. Indeed, in the final analysis, the Battle of Crete might be regarded as a highly ambiguous Pyrrhic victory for the Germans. Hitler was displeased with the operation, which produced more proportional losses of soldiers and planes than any of his previous conquests, from Poland to France. With 6,000 casualties, killed and wounded, Hitler decided that large, independent airborne operations should not be repeated. Reflecting both the intensity of casualty figures and Hitler's consequent determination to reject airborne warfare, Karl von Student famously described the Battle of Crete as, quote, the graveyard of the German paratroopers, end quote. Despite their victory, the Germans, to their great misfortune, did not capitalize on their conquest of Crete. Hitler, like Wawel, ignored Crete once the island was under his control. As a result, he squandered an extraordinary strategic advantage and opportunity. From Crete, with sufficient forces, Hitler was positioned to establish air superiority over the Eastern Mediterranean, complete the destruction of the British Mediterranean fleet begun by the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Crete, choke, if not seize, the Suez Canal, and thus deliver a decisive blow against the British Empire in the Middle East. Hitler's short-sightedness about the immediate strategic potential of Crete can be attributed to his obsessive preoccupation with the invasion of the Soviet Union. The role of Crete in German war planning was formalized in an official directive issued by Hitler on May 23, while the Battle of Crete was still raging. Hitler's order declared that the decision about future operations from Crete to break the British position in the Eastern Mediterranean would be determined only after the invasion and destruction of the Soviet Union. And of course, that time would never materialize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that very succinct, detailed account of the historical background as to leading up to the Battle of Crete and to what took place there, and the time allowed it, which is, I appreciate you will be able to do that. It's a lot of material there. And now we will go on to our next presenter, Professor Papadakis. But before I do, just a reminder to our audience, if they would like to ask a question, we will take those questions at the end after Professor Papadakis presents. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom that you see there on your screens and submit your question. And now just a few words regarding our next presenter, somebody who was exceptionally well known in the Greek American community, a good friend for many, many years, who has also served as a board member of the American Hellenic Institute. Professor Papadakis is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Dean Emeritus of the College of Arts and Sciences, Indiana University, Purdue University. It's a mouthful, but it's there. He is also a Rector Emeritus of the University of Nicosia in Nicosia, Cyprus. And between 2012 and 2014, he served as president of the Hellenic Quality Assurance and Accreditation Agency of the Government of Greece. He has authored and edited several books and over 100 articles published in academic journals and books in the United States and Europe. He holds a PhD from the University of Michigan and honorary doctorates from Indiana University and from the University of Nicosia. In 1998, had the high honor, or the president of Greece awarded him with the decoration of the Order of the Phoenix for his contributions to Hellenic letters. Professor Koufoudakis, it's always a pleasure to have you here at one of our AHI events, and we welcome you once again and look forward to your comments on the commemoration of our Battle of Crete presentation today.
Well, thank you, Nick, for sponsoring this very important event. Thank you also to Emily Bandis for helping in organizing this particular discussion. And thank you also to the sponsors that have been making possible these discussions on Zoom. Now, as we heard earlier today, the operation known as Operation Mercury involved the German airborne attack on the island of Crete that began on May the 20th, 1941. Now, Crete was the last Greek territory in the hands of the Greek government and the Allies, following, of course, the German invasion of mainland Greece. The Battle of Crete formally ended on June 1, 1941, with the surrender of the Greek and the Allied forces that could not be evacuated to Egypt. The island was invaded by German paratroops, joined later by a small number of Italians that landed on Crete to support their Axis allies. At the time of the invasion, Crete was defended, as we heard earlier today, by large numbers of Greek and Allied troops who had been evacuated primarily from the mainland of Greece. Unfortunately, though, these forces were totally inadequate, they're under-equipped, and therefore they could not really provide for a good defense of the island. The airborne invasion of Crete was the first and also the last major airborne invasion launched by German forces during World War II. The losses suffered in paratroops and aircraft were such that Germany never tried an operation of that scale for the rest of the war. In contrast, British and American planners studied carefully the lessons of the Battle of Crete for their subsequent operations in liberating Europe. For the rest of the war, German paratroop units, amazingly enough, fought primarily as ground forces. The Battle of Crete was a classic case of heroism by the defending forces and by the civilian population of Crete. The Battle of Crete is a historic first because of the participation of the local population in the defense of the island against the German invasion. Consequently, the Germans resorted to mass civilian massacres, including those at Condonari on June 2, 1941, the destruction of Candanos, and the killing of all its population, men, women, and children. The battle was marked by communication failures, poor Allied planning, let alone command structure, and of course, all sorts of Allied tactical errors that basically allowed the Germans to seize control of the Malmö field and, of course, turned the tide of the battle in their favor. This was really the reality of what took place in Crete, and I think my colleague Alex Kiro presented a very clear picture of that development. The German massacres continued on Crete as the island developed a major resistance movement involving the local population and Greek and Allied forces that could not be evacuated to Egypt. The invasion of Crete showed both the importance and the limitations of good intelligence. The British had broken Germany's Enigma code, and they were aware of the impending invasion, but could not use that information effectively. One, they did not want to reveal or compromise their sources, and two, even though they knew that invasion was coming, they were unable to organize a proper defense of the island of Crete. Operation Mercury, the German, of course, invasion of Crete, created divisions within the German military command. The German army was preoccupied with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. They did not want to be sidetracked from that particular task.
If I may interrupt you for a second, can you maybe hold up your papers a little bit, because all we see is the top of your head when you're speaking.
Right? Can you see me better?
Yes.
In contrast, the German Air Force and Paratroop Command promoted the operation to invade Crete by air. The conquest of Crete was seen as opening the road to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Cyprus, and of course to the Middle East. Cretan fields were important also for the German air operations in Egypt and North Africa. Now, as the Germans got the upper hand on Crete, a massive evacuation effort got underway, involving, of course, Allied and Greek troops. A mini Dunkirk operation evacuated thousands to Egypt. Those troops went on to fight in Egypt and to North Africa. Among the people evacuated, of course, was King George of Greece, who was in Crete and was safely evacuated to Egypt. Military losses, as Alex Kiru presented, were significant, both in terms of people and aircraft. So the historic Battle of Crete is marked by tales of heroism by Allied and Greek forces and by the local population. Despite the surrender of Crete, the battle was a morale booster in occupied Greece. The resistance that operated on Crete tied down significant German forces for the remainder of the war. It also ended any German designs on Cyprus and on the Eastern Mediterranean. I want to stress the bravery of those left behind. I will give you two examples. One was the 8th Greek regiment that held the German advance at Aliakinos for almost a week. That allowed for the evacuation of some 16,000 Allied troops to Egypt. Also, the May 27, 1941, bayonet charge by Maori New Zealand troops on what is known as 42nd Street. This is a 2-mile, very difficult road between Suda and Hanya. The bayonet charge is one of the most epic battles of World War II. We honor those who fought, who had the courage to fight the kind of battle they did on Crete. We honor them particularly because the Maori New Zealand troops were fighting thousands of miles away from their homeland for a land they did not know anything about. Now there are monuments all over Athens, in Greece, and of course on Crete, commemorating the Battle of Crete. The city of Athens has erected a very beautiful monument commemorating the sacrifices of Australian and New Zealand forces, Stopedion to Areos, one of the second largest public park in Athens. And of course, the island of Crete is full of monuments commemorating that particular event. Now, the loss of Crete was in many ways covered by the fact that on May the 27th, 1941, British and Allied British forces basically sunk the Bismarck, the German battleship, and that was a kind of a morale booster on the part of the Allies that sidetracked public attention from the loss of Crete. The German invasion of Crete affected the planning for Operation Barbarossa. At the same time, it killed, for all practical purposes, any plans that Germany may have had for Cyprus, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Today, the Cretan countryside is dotted with all those monuments we talked about. It is a forgotten event of World War II, We commemorate its 80th anniversary today, but remember also that it took almost something like 20 years after the end of World War II for Germans to go back to Crete, both as tourists, but also as families of those who died during the invasion. It took time to calm down the spirits given what took place in terms of the German army's actions on the civilian population of Crete. We honor their memory and all those who fought to protect liberty in the island of Crete.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Koufoudakis. And I would recommend that anyone listening and who's never been to Crete, if they do visit, they should go at least and visit the cemetery there, where so many are laid to rest who fought in this battle 80 years ago, and to pay their respects. We have ample time for a Q&A, and I would like to encourage our audience to submit some questions. In the meantime, if I can get started here with that phase of this program of the Q&A. You know, I learned a little bit something here today regarding Freiburg. In fact, I never realized that he was what you said, Professor Kiro, the 7th commander there in a relatively short period of time. So I guess even though he made some major blunders himself, is it fair to say, I guess, that he came into this thing with a huge handicap when he arrived? I believe you said, what, late April of 41? And of course, the battle took place just about, what, 3 weeks later. So is it fair to put all the blame on him in terms of the ultimate failure of the battle?
No, of course not, Nick. I hope I didn't imply that. But what I did want to make clear is that Freiburg lost remarkable opportunities during the course of the operation, but the conditions that he encountered when he first arrived on the island were almost overwhelmingly the responsibility and the conditions were produced by the negligence, indifference, and incompetence of his commander, the Supreme Allied Commander at the time in Cairo, Archibald Wavell. So the chief responsibility for the lack of sufficient preparation on the island rests with Wavell, who repeatedly, without really sound justification, shifted commanders in and out of the island, who did not provide them with sufficient time, who did not provide them with sufficient resources, and who assigned very little attention himself, and hence assigned virtually no attention from his executive administrative staff to preparations for an invasion. Where Freiburg, I think, is to be held responsible in terms of his failures, it was in not reading effectively the overwhelming information that came to him through multiple sources of intelligence that should have indicated to him that there was a possibility for at least a multi-pronged invasion of Crete, one not limited to a seaborne invasion. And furthermore, given the Royal Navy's complete and total command of the waterways around Crete, his predisposition to believe that only a seaborne invasion was something that the Germans contemplated was really without justification. That was his chief blunder. There were many things he could have done, even in the span of 3 weeks, that would have enhanced the prospects for defense. But yes, I agree with you. He was placed in a virtually untenable position by virtue of what preceded his arrival on the island.
Two more on Freiburg, if I may. It's been said that once the battle began, one of his bigger failures, if you can address this, was that he did not destroy the airfields, which by allowing the airfields to be used and functional, this allowed ultimately for more troops to be brought in by the Germans, and ultimately tipped the scales of balance in their favor. Is that a fair assessment? And what was the reason that he felt at that time why didn't he destroy the airfields? And I assume that would have been his final decision at that moment in time during the battle. Is that right?
He didn't destroy the airfield, something he could have done in advance, precisely because he completely dismissed the possibility that the airfields were objectives of the German invasion. Excuse me. He dismissed the possibility that this would be an airborne invasion. So the condition of the airfields were moot for him. If anything, he wanted to preserve the airfields, keep them intact for the use of the very limited number of planes that he had at his disposal.
And then with Freiburg, what do we know about him after this battle? What was his legacy? What did he go on to do, if anything? Do we know?
He's most remembered, and this, I think, tells us something about his record of performance during the Second World War. He's most remembered in New Zealand and in the UK as a hero of the First World War, where he served on the Western Front with exceptional success and a record of valor.
Trench warfare, huh?
So I think you can come to your own conclusions, Nick.
Yes. Van, it's extraordinary that here's an island that's so strategically important, acknowledges being strategically important, but yet both the British and the Germans, the Allies and the Germans, ultimately failed, and it was alluded to by, Professor Curo in this, in terms of utilizing it to the potential. Why do you think, what was the thinking here? Why ultimately didn't, there wasn't enough resources put in here by the to begin with, and then ultimately how the Germans, it can't be just the fact that Hitler was just preoccupied only with the Soviet Union at the time. Can you give any speculation as to why so much lives were lost here, and yet it was never really utilized properly?
Well, again, pretty much as we have discussed earlier today, the fact remains that in the case of England, the troops sent to Greece were inadequate, they were not well equipped, and when they withdrew into Crete, again, they were not prepared for what came in May, at the end of May of 1941. They had the intelligence, but again, this shows you the pluses and minuses of having good intelligence, but not being able to use it effectively to decide what to do from there on. End result was a fiasco on both sides, because the Germans thought it was going to be a walkover. It turned out not to be. The British were not really ready to fight. The scale of the invasion that we saw by airborne troops, and the result, a lot of casualties, a lot of innocent people died, and at the end, of course, the war took different turns for both sides. The important thing at the end of the day was what it did to the Germans, both in terms of military morale. They never tried something like that again. At the same time, the fact that it affected their operations in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. They had ideas about Cyprus, they had ideas about the Middle East. All that went down in flames.
Let me also just answer a question. Somebody asked where the cemetery is, and the one I visited was outside of Chania. There might be others on Crete, I'm not familiar, but the one I visited and I referred to was outside of Chania. There's a question here by somebody who asks, how true are the stories of the people of Crete killing paratroopers as they landed? I've heard of yayas using pitchforks. Now we hear the stories about how the local residents of Crete fought fiercely using whatever they had at their disposal, including the aforementioned pitchforks. These stories are true, I assume, right?
Yes, and well documented.
Very good. Somebody asked the question, did the Germans ever pay any reciprocities to Crete and its people? Do we know of any of that?
A lot of the German military involved in the massacres have been tried and convicted for civilian cruelty and all those kinds of things. There have been some reparations by Germany on Crete, but nothing given the kind of destruction they brought to Crete. The kind of mass casualties they did by their operations in destroying villages, killing civilian populations, things like that.
Can any of you speak more regarding what the population of Crete endured in the aftermath after this invasion, regarding the German reprisals that took upon the civilian population? And were these the SS that were doing this? Was it the regular army? What was the makeup of the army, the German army?
Everybody. The German army simply used the worst possible tactics because it had a very vibrant underground movement throughout the island. As I mentioned earlier, it involved not only the Crete population, it involved Greek military that stayed behind, it involved British military that stayed behind, joined the guerrilla forces, and therefore the fighting continued throughout World War II. End result, the more casualties they created of the Germans, the more brutal the Germans became against the local population. There's another famous massacre. Towards the end of the war, a German general was kidnapped by British commandos on Crete and was taken to Egypt. Again, a spectacular activity, but of questionable military value. The point is, civilians paid dearly for the kidnapping of the German general.
The occupation of Crete, Nick, like the occupation of the rest of Greece and most of Eastern Europe, was characterized by brutality, barbarity, and extreme violence. Something in excess of 30,000 Cretan civilians were killed / murdered during the occupation. And as Van pointed out, these atrocities began in earnest the very first 24 hours after the end of fighting, after the conclusion of the Battle of Crete. In other words, there was no military justification whatsoever for the first day of killing of civilians on Crete, nor was there any justification for such actions thereafter. During the 4 years, Crete was one of the last parts of Greece because it had been overstepped by the liberating forces that returned in 44. Crete was one of the last parts of occupied Greece to be liberated. What the Cretan population endured was horrific. And as Van pointed out, because of the crimes perpetrated against the civilian population, those memories did not fade. They're part of Crete's living history and historical memory. And just as Britain, I would add here, parenthetically, Britain also complicated Greece's efforts to achieve post-war justice for the people of Crete by refusing to cooperate with Greek authorities to, for instance, turn over the first person responsible for ordered executions, summary executions of Cretan civilians. Van mentioned the massacre that took place in the village of Commemoration and elsewhere. That was Karl Vaughn's student from his comfortable palatial residence in the Hotel Grand Britannia as a message to the Cretan population and as an act of outrage because the Cretans had resisted this invasion, something the Germans hadn't encountered on any front of operations during the war. He had people killed. The Greek authorities after the war asked that student be returned to Greece for trial as a war criminal. Now, the British tried him. They tried him in Western Europe. He was found guilty of criminal executions of British captives during the war. He was imprisoned, but he was released in 1947 for fictitious reasons of health. He lived comfortably the rest of his life until he died in West Germany in 1978. The British did not help the Greek authorities in returning a single war criminal for trial in Greece among those who committed crimes in Crete.
Majesty. There's a question here. At the risk of speculating, how does a successful defense of Crete change the Eastern Mediterranean for the Allies?
Well, in every conceivable way. I tried to touch on why Crete was such an invaluable strategic asset in the 1940s. It's even a greater strategic asset in today's landscape in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. But Crete, in the hands of the Allies, just to target one point of crucial importance, Crete could have served as a staging base for the bombing of the Ploest oil fields in Romania, which was something the Allies weren't able to undertake until their invasion of southern Italy in 1943. So beginning in 1941, if the British had been able to hold on to Crete, they could have begun the bombing of the key fuel resource driving the German armed forces throughout Europe in Romania. That in and of itself made Crete an invaluable resource. And that's precisely why Hitler targeted Crete as a necessary conquest. That's just one. There are many other points. I don't want to repeat what I talked about in terms of, yes.
This is a question for both of you. The question there asks, since was alluded as to how the consequences of this battle impacted how both sides viewed Cyprus. Could you elaborate on any further reports to this effect? Were there any Axis power operations or intentions for Cyprus that were scrapped as a result?
Not that I'm aware of, but the British were very concerned about the fate of Cyprus as the German forces took over Greece, took over Crete, and of course, Turkey remained a so-called neutral during the war, in the early stages of the war, working with the Germans, later on attempting to separate itself from German tutelage and German control. So, yeah, I mean, there was a real risk. I have not seen any extensive evidence that the Germans had planned to carry out major operations on Cyprus, but it was really an island that's very strategic, near the Suez Canal, near the oil fields in the Middle East, and that was a major concern for the Allies.
Yeah, Van's absolutely right. In terms of grand strategy, the Germans were not focused on Cyprus. In particular, what small attention had been given to Cyprus in looking to the future, that diminished with the loss of the Vichy government friendly toward the Germans in Syria. The Italians actually bombed Cyprus. They conducted one bombing sortie over Cyprus from bases and roads. That was the one and only direct action against Cyprus, done for reasons of propaganda. It had obviously no military effect whatsoever.
They're still trying to get a victory over a Hellenic world somewhere. We have a question here, falls under the category of lessons learned. Gentleman asks, how much did the Allies themselves learn from the German paratrooper mistakes in Crete? Mistakes which they didn't want to repeat, say with their own paratrooper drops on D-Day in Normandy. Was there anything taken, by your opinion, of the Allies regarding that paratrooper campaign that they applied with success in D-Day, on D-Day?
Sure. Van pointed out something very important, and that is that the Germans and the Anglo-Americans came to very different studied conclusions about the significance of airborne operations. They learned different lessons. The Germans learned that their lesson was that such operations were too costly, that they were not viable, that they couldn't be conducted in the near future. British and American planners and strategists came to a very different conclusion. They concluded that operations needed to be more combined arms directed, that operations needed to be larger, and they also needed to be coordinated with ground forces in order to be effective. That airborne operations on their own had limited potential for success, but where they were to take place, they would have to take place in large force, not just one division, but like what we saw in Normandy, 2 airborne and 1 American airborne divisions, the equivalent of a corps. The Battle of Crete, in some ways, is the birthplace of America's much celebrated 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. But we also see some of the same mistakes that the Germans produced in their operations in Crete still coming forward in Allied operations in the West. In 1944, Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Airborne troops there experienced a horrific failure and casualties, not unlike what the Germans encountered on Crete.
Finally, and this is one of my pet peeves, Greece, if you start with October 28, 1940, culminating with the end of the Battle of Crete, it's approximately 7 months until the country itself fully was occupied by the Germans, the Axis, where other countries were, in Central Europe, major powers were falling within days and weeks. Some would, the Germans were just walking in without any resistance whatsoever. The Greeks fought for every single inch that the Axis powers ultimately were able to occupy. And again, as I said in my opening comments, there are those historians who attribute Greece for changing the tide of World War II with the delay of Operation Barbarossa. One, can you speak to that effect in your own opinions? Because there are those who don't believe that was the case, but I'll be interested in hearing your perspective on the turning of the tide of the war. And then the last but not least, and you're both historians that are and have been, Van, in your case, for many years at American academic institutions, and Professor Curie, you currently at a current academic institution. Does the history really do justice to the efforts of Greece in World War II and its contributions, and even the Battle of Crete? We've had at least two movies that I'm aware of on the battle, the Dunkirk disaster of the Brits, and so many other famous movies regarding World War II. And yet Hollywood has never taken notice regarding the contributions of the Greek resistance and the significance of Greece in World War II. Barely footnotes in any history books that I have seen and that I have taken regarding World War II. Now I know there's been a movie, there's a documentary that was mentioned here, and I'll mention it. It was done by the Spanos family, and it's called The 11th Day. And it's a documentary about an hour and a half. But I'm talking about mainstream American Hollywood movies on World War II, which is God knows how many have been made. And yet Greece, Battle of Crete, significance, barely a footnote. I said a lot, I asked a lot here. Can you touch upon some of those comments, both of you?
Go ahead.
Well, Nick, I would say that I think the problems with Hollywood go far beyond its lack of attention to the Greek historical record in the Second World War. Maybe we can return to that subject another time, but I'm willing to take a shot here at influential Greek Americans involved in filmmaking and creative production in Hollywood. It is troubling to see celebrations of certain histories, revisionism and whitewashing of certain imperial histories, for example, and complete indifference to other histories. Ted Sarandos, the creative director at probably now the most influential source for the production of entertainment in Hollywood, Netflix, is himself a Greek American. Perhaps people in the Greek American community could connect him to a rich history he might not be familiar with, because there he'll find a limitless source for cinematic storytelling from antiquity through Byzantium to the Second World War. In terms of American scholars' attention, I think it's not surprising that there hasn't been much attention given to Greece in popular and even scholarly writing on the Second World War. The British, of course, are preoccupied with and continually lionize their own role in the war. Even when they write about the war in Greece, they basically write about themselves in Greece, ignoring the Albanian War and other dimensions of the war. And I think here it's important to note that the rapid overrunning of Greece, Nick, you pointed out that Greece maintained a successful defense against fascist Italy for many, many months. The cratering of the Greek defense in the north of the country in the spring of 1941 was produced not by Greek forces, but by the British Expeditionary Force, which was at the center of the Greek army, still fighting successfully against the Italians in Albania, and the Greeks in defensive positions along the Metaxas line near the Bulgarian border. And as testament to the really extraordinary martial ferocity of the Greeks, Hitler issued an order shortly after the capturing of Athens that Greek prisoners of war should be released into the civilian population. Why? Because he was impressed by their martial prowess and their valor. And that speaks, I think, to the really extraordinary record of Greek military performance in this first stage of the war. Also, too, again, what is problematic about the lack of attention to Greece and its role in the war is something that extends well beyond Greece. The outcome of the Second World War in Europe was determined by the colossal, gigantic conflict between the Red Army on one hand and the Germans and the Axis forces in the Soviet Union. It's not the United States or Britain who won the war in Europe. The United States won the war in the Pacific, but in Europe, it was the Red Army that won the war. But before the outcome of the war, Greece played a role highly disproportionate to its numbers, size, and power. Let's not forget, you've pointed out yourself, Greece was the first country on the European continent to inflict a blow on the Axis, to thwart an invasion. And really, Greece is responsible for rendering fascist Italy, which until October 1940 was taken as a serious power. Greece was responsible for rendering Italy, and in particular Mussolini, an international joke.
Van, did you want to add anything?
No, I agree fully with what Alex has said. And remember, at the end of the day, history is written by the victors. And at the end of the day,
but Greece was also on the side of the victors, though.
yes, but a small country that had its own problems at the end of World War II. And of course, the history goes, what have you done for me today? We have also failed to promote what Greece did during the war. We have ample documentation. We have failed to promote that.
Before I make some closing comments, again, on the comment I made, in your opinion, can we attribute the turning of the tide of World War II with what Greece did in delaying Operation Barbarossa, in your opinions?
Frankly, no.
I would also agree with Van. No. And you know what, Nick? I think it would be a great opportunity for the AHI community to visit this subject, devote some time to it, have another webinar conference where we can talk critically about this. This is not to diminish Greece's contribution to the Allied war effort. It is important and colossal, but a kind of preoccupation with attention to the postponement of Barbarossa casts attention away from really the critical outcome of the war in Albania and Greece's successful defense against Italy in altering the direction of the war. It's something I've written about. It's something I'd be happy to talk with the AHI community about, and I know Van would be very much interested in this as well.
Well, it's definitely something we'll look into, and maybe we can build it around October 28th when we like to celebrate here at the American Hellenic Institute, because we take very seriously the role of Greece's role in World War II and the contributions that it made and how they're important today as it relates specifically also to U.S. interests, which is why we go through this painstaking process of always commemorating October 28th and the Battle of Crete here at the American Hellenic Institute. And as was alluded to in the beginning, it's important to note that today the island of Crete continues to play a tremendous geostrategic and important role for the projection of Western and specifically U.S. interests. If no one, again, I have the unique opportunity to have visited the multifaceted military facilities on the island of Crete at Suda Bay, where it's not just one, but it's a multitude of facilities, of which one of the most important is the naval base there. And of course, where there is a U.S. Military facility, and of which there is today a U.S. naval ship that is permanently housed there, and it provides for the projection of U.S. geostrategic interests, and why A couple of years ago, there was approximately $50 million authorized for the upgrade of those facilities from the U.S. Congress. It takes on a much more meaningful role and will continue to do so today, 80 years later, as it did 80 years ago. And we will continue to bring that to the attention of our membership in the AHI community. But for today, we will leave it at that. I'd like to thank our two professors today, our two close friends, for presenting and commemorating this important historical date in world history, I'd like to say. As always, I'd like to thank our sponsors for helping bring these AHI virtual presentations to life. And as always, I want to thank our staff led by our producer of our AHI virtual presentations, Emily Pandis, and our government relations director, Elias Yerasulis. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you once again for tuning in today and to wish all of you a good summer. And we look forward to you the next time around. Thank you once again and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you, man.